It's a pleasure to be here and talk to you tonight about one of my favorite things, which is the landscape. And it's on a special day, right? Today is the first day of spring, which in my mind is maybe the second best day of the year. You know, your birthday always has to be first, but I think spring is the second best day. And there were lots of people outside, rollerblading, walking, in their yards. I even saw people aerating today, so I think it's appropriate that we're here talking about this today. As Ruth mentioned, I have a undergraduate degree in biology and master's degree from CU Denver in landscape architecture. Been working with the City of Greeley for about 15 years now. I have done private design in the past, but I'm probably happiest in the garden, in my crazy hair, working on my garlic or whatever else it is that I happen to be growing or experimenting with that year. So we're going to talk a little bit. Xeriscape design and with maintenance in mind is what Ruth titled our presentation today and kind of directed me to where we wanted to go with this conversation. And I think it's a great conversation. And some of our objectives for this evening will be to talk about, one, the principles of Xeriscape. You may have heard of them before, but we're going to talk a little bit about it at the beginning of the presentation. We're going to go through some site planning. We're also going to talk about some of the key elements of design that are often not talked about. And then we're going to talk a little bit about code requirements too, because anytime you're redoing your landscape in the yard, you need to take that into consideration. And then we'll talk about maintenance considerations at the end. So we're going to review here the 7 principles of Xeric design. And the first is plan and design. That's the very first piece that needs to go into play. So planning as it relates to your design and what you want to do in your yard is the #1 step that you need to take when working on your Xeric design. The second is using practical turf areas. So that's taking a real hard look at your landscape and how you use it. Do you really need to have bluegrass on the side yard where you're stacking your firewood and you never go? So you need to take kind of that overall look. What are you doing in each space? What plant material is really realistic for the types of uses that you'll use in those spaces? So being practical with the types of turf that are needed. And maybe in some cases, it doesn't need to be turf. Third, using appropriate plants. And that goes along with turf too, but looking at what are your site conditions? What are the appropriate plants for the place and space that you were looking at? Heights, widths, the amount of water needed, and how does that all relate to the zones of your yard, the different heat, the different sun exposure, so that you're being very purposeful where you're putting those plants. Improve your soils. Each and every time you do landscaping in your yard, that's an opportunity for you to improve your soil profile. Improvement in your soil profile often helps the soil to hold additional moisture, but it also supports that plant material. So every single time you make improvements in your yard, one of those steps should be improving your soil profile. Use mulches. We talked about maybe sod isn't always appropriate, but mulch may be appropriate in and around the base of your plants to help hold moisture. Mulch also can improve the soil profile as it decomposes. So that plays an important role as well throughout your landscape. And then irrigate efficiently is the 7th principle of Xeriscape gardening. In other words, are you applying the right amount of water for the plants in that location? Do you have spray where drip would probably be more efficient? Or are you using heads that are maybe too big or putting down too much water? And you need to be aware of how your sprinkler system is operating at all times. Now, I think that gets us right at 7, and I don't usually follow the rules, so I've added an 8. Or this is the 8th, is maintenance, making sure you're maintaining your landscape appropriately, but then adding an 8th principle, which is capturing rainwater and snow and runoff. This is something that's become very important in Colorado landscape. Ruth's talking about her rain barrels. How can we capture that rain that comes off the roof, funnel it into a part of our landscape where it can help supplement the water, or maybe it's the sole source of water in that portion of your landscape. but it's a legitimate Xeriscape design principle, and we should be conscientious about that when we're redesigning our landscapes in our yard. So, like I said, because I don't follow the rules, we have to have an 8th one as well. And I think if you talk to a lot of landscape designers now, when they're looking at and designing for private clients, they're taking a look at this as well, because it's an opportunity to expand upon what's already going on in your yard. So Xeriscape, what does that look like? Is it the picture on the left with the turf? Is it the picture on the right? It could be both. If you've followed all those principles of Xeriscape design when you're developing, putting your design together, your landscape truly can look like either one of these if you're purposeful in how you put it together. So it's important to remember, it doesn't have to be, some people think of Xeriscape, you know, there's that misnomer, the Xeroscape. It doesn't have to be that, but it does have to be very purposeful from the outset when you begin designing your yard or your landscape or redesigning your yard. One of the things I want you to think about when you're working on the design of your yard is that you give yourself reasonable expectations. No amount of landscaping is ever going to be maintenance-free. No matter what you do, your landscape is going to require maintenance. Coincidentally, you know, we've got a rocked front yard, and I think many of us have seen this example throughout our community, where we've, you know, you rock the front yard, you think that's good, there's no plant material here to maintain, we throw down some mulch, good, we're done, right? Well, it works that way for the first couple of years, but then the weed seeds blow in and the dirt blows in, and you still get some green vegetation anyway, and it may not necessarily be the kind you want. But you still have maintenance that you have to do. The trick is in being clear with yourself about how much maintenance you want to do before you even start your landscape project. How much time do you want to spend in the yard? And how do you want to spend that time? Do you want to mow? Do you like cutting down perennials and annuals? Do you want to be out there with those plants? Be reasonable and really think about the amount of time that you want to spend. Coincidentally, this yard does not meet code because your front yards must be at least 50% landscaped materials. So those are some of the things that we'll talk about as we get down further. Additionally, there's a ton of evidence that talks about landscape and the role of landscape and greening of the urban environment, and the benefits of that, not only to you, yourselves, and your family, but to your community as well. Now, some of these, I'm not going to read them out. It seems like they're kind of anecdotal, right? We presume we're less stressed, you know, we've got less stress when we're in green environment. But the truth is there's actually a 30-year body of research on many of these topics that show these actually truly are true. They've taken kids who have moved from more dense urban concrete environments, moved them to landscapes or what would be termed a greener home, maybe homes that, you know, from apartment building actually to a landscaped yard. And those kids had actual improvements in their educational performance and actually their behavioral as well. And this is research that's been tracked over 30 years. It's also an immunizer, helps people deal better with stress, and actually on a streetscape where you've got trees and shrubs and all of those pieces, just the fact that you have plant material on the periphery calms traffic. Isn't that crazy? But it's true, and there's a lot of data out there to prove that. So remember, if you think you're going to do just the rock landscape, it doesn't affect just you and your yard, right? It's your community and all of those around you as well. So moving on to planning, we're going to talk a little bit about your design and where you might get started. So the site plan is the very first place that you start when you're planning your landscape. And there's a few steps that you need to go through to laying out your site plan. There's a lot of information that you need to put on this site plan, and sometimes it can be a little elusive about where you get this information or what you actually need to have. But you want to start with an actual scaled drawing of your yard. And you can go out and you can measure this off. You can draw it out on a piece of graph paper. Do what works for you. Choose the mechanism that is right for you to get all of that data collected. Another option is you can use an aerial image. If you go to greeleygov.com, there's a link in there called Maps. And you can go into the maps. You can actually type in an address and you can pull up the aerial view of your home. You can do it through the Weld County Government webpage as well. But you can zoom in and get an actual aerial picture of your home as it sits right now. And that can help you trace off or do a nice site drawing of your home to help you get started on planning your landscape. One of the things that you're going to need to make sure that you capture in the drawing that may not be readily apparent to you is your utilities, both overhead and underground. And the way to get at that information is to call 811. This is a notorious call before you dig number. They say even if you're going to scratch the surface of the soil by 6 inches, you really do need to call 811 and get a utility located. But you can do this even before you plan, 3-4 months before you plan to dig a hole. This can be a part of your planning process. You call 811, they're going to ask you if you're residential, or if you're a municipality, and you're going to say, I'm a residential, and they're going to ask you some scary questions about directional boring and dynamite, and you're going to say, no, I'm just going to plant a tree. And so they'll take all of your information, and they're going to ask you what portion of your yard. They're going to get your address, and you may want to say, well, we're going to plant in the front, and we're going to plant in the back, so please mark my entire yard. And they're going to come out and put color-coded markings on the ground all throughout your yard. You know the basic utilities that need to go into your home, right? You're going to need water, so you're going to be looking for that blue mark. Most of us probably have cable TV, so there should be an orange mark around somewhere. Oil and gas, you may be seeing electrical. You're probably going to see some sewer, because all that stuff's got to go into your house, right? And some stuff's all got to get back out. So you've got a good idea of what kind of marks that you're going to see on the ground. It takes approximately 24 to 48 hours for them to mobilize all the utilities and get all the marks on the ground for you. If you think something's missing, call back up and say, hey, I don't think they captured it all. And they'll come back out. And they're going to notify you that your utilities are clear and everything's marked. Now that's going to cover everything on the ground and below ground. But you're going to need to think a little bit about overhead. A lot of us have electrical lines that come into our homes overhead, and you want to make sure that you capture that on your site plan as well. But be sure to utilize this resource. Legislation has changed recently in Colorado in regards to disturbing utilities and calling in locates, and you can be fined if you do damage because you didn't call something in. So be sure that you do that. It's easy, it's free, it costs nothing. There's no reason ever not to do it. So make sure that you spend the time on it. This is going to inform your site plan, right? We're probably not going to want to plant a really tall tree under a 10-foot overhead power line. And those are the things that you need to take into consideration. All right. I mentioned earlier the aerial maps that you can get through greeleygov.com. I'm going through the maps resource. You can also get some utility information off of these maps. In the bottom left-hand corner, there's a little button, and it looks like sheets of paper stacked on top of each other. Oh, yep, you can see it right here. I got it captured in the screen print. If you click on that, right here, well, I lost my mouse. Okay, right here, so these little layers of paper. This button too, when it typically comes up, it's kind of green and gray. It doesn't show the aerial image, but you'll click on this button and it'll click to this aerial image. You go over here and you click on your layers and you can turn on your utilities. Now this is not as good as your marks on the ground that you're going to transfer to your plan, but this will give you an idea of what you need to be looking for in your yard and where it needs to be. It can help you, give you a clue if something gets missed in your utility locate. Now your utility locates, you need to remember, if you put in anything private, you ran electrical from your house out to the shed, your utility locate center is not going to locate that for you. You need to know where all of those pieces are. Another thing that may be in the ground that you've put there, all your sprinkler lines, they're not going to mark that stuff for you. That's your personal homeowner responsibility. So keep those pieces in mind as well. So your site plan, what does this start to look like? You've got your scaled drawing. You know how many, I've got this one marked, 1 inch equals 20 feet. That's how I scaled this drawing out. We've got an outline of the house there. We've captured all of our hardscape. Any existing trees or vegetation that we might want to preserve or may not want to preserve, we want to see that on there. Anything, air conditioners, existing garden beds, septic fields. I know there's a few people in this town that still have stuff like that. You want to make sure that you get that on your plan because you're not going to be wanting planting on that. Fences, location of your fences, and once again, I mentioned the overhead utilities. You want to make sure you capture all of your pieces. This is the basis for the planning of your landscape. Make sure it's as accurate as you can get it for what you have currently on the ground. This is like starting, when you have to start with good ingredients when you're cooking. And this is your basis of good ingredients for your landscape design. You've got to have this accurate, and you've got to spend some time thinking about this. It also helps you become familiar with your yard, maybe some things you hadn't thought about yet. One of the things I like to make sure that I put on my site plans is windows, because your experience inside your house, a lot is what you're seeing when you look out your windows into your landscape. So you want to highlight those on your plan as well. Also, where are your doors? Those are important pieces to capture on here as well. Moving on, the next piece that you're going to do with your plan is your inventory analysis. This is also called an opportunities and constraints analysis. You can take that base map. Sometimes I just make multiple copies of that initial plan because you're going to sketch and work on this piece a lot. Or you can put trace paper over it. If you've got kids at home or your school teacher, you got trace paper around, that's a fun way to work too. And you can layer that on top of this drawing, or you just do multiple revisions. But the idea on this inventory analysis is really to capture those things in your yard that are important and are going to inform your decisions for your landscaping. So, example, what's existing vegetation? How big is it? Does it prevent it? Is it screening something? Are there certain climate conditions in your yard that you're aware of? You probably know where it's cooler in your yard and where it's hotter. That's a reflection of how much sun the area is getting, or maybe shaded. And those are pieces you want to capture on this. Where's your drainage? Do you have areas of poor drainage? Is there water always holding in one area of your yard? That's something you'd want to put on your plan, because this is going to inform things later, right? When you start thinking about plant material and what goes where. Do you have slopes that are going to affect what goes on or a certain part of the design in your yard? Water runs off slopes quicker. Those are probably going to be drier areas in your yard. So you're going to want to put that on there too. I put up prevailing winds here on mine. Some important notes here, curb appeal. So obviously the front yard up here, this helps us understand where our public views are. I've noted where we're particularly flat in the yard. Put your streets on there. That's going to start to inform maybe where you want some screening to go. And you'll see my utilities are showing up here. We got a gas line coming in. We've got an overhead power line marked here. And then we've got some where the existing beds and vegetation are in the yard. Now, this starts to tell some interesting stories. This yard had some existing landscape in it and was looking to redesign the landscape. So you start to look at that and you start to think, what am I going to keep and what am I going to get rid of? Well, you start looking at, well, where do our prevailing winds come from? And what do we want to screen? We've got a street down over here. And lo and behold, we've got some pretty established trees that are already footing the bill for some of that work in this yard because they've been there already for 30 years, right? So we've got a nice set of evergreens blocking prevailing winds. We've got a beautiful screen here already from the neighbor's drive, lo and behold. And then we've got 18th Avenue back here, so some established vegetation here. Oh, look, somebody must have been thinking because it's blocking the views from the patio out to the street. And then we've got a neighbor's drive down here and another bunch of vegetation. So somebody was very thoughtful when they planted their trees and laid out this landscape already. So what do we have that we can already work with? What are those pieces that are already doing the hard work for us that we can incorporate into our landscape design going forward? And sometimes this isn't only about what's on your yard, it can be about what's in your neighbor's yard too. Because if your neighbor's got a set of evergreens planted over here, there's no reason for you to duplicate that. But it may also inform the light or soil conditions in your yard. So you want to capture a little bit of that in your plan as well. Design considerations. Now I talked about a little bit asking yourself some cold hard questions about how much maintenance you want to do in your yard and what that looks like for you. Some of the other questions you need to really think about and take some notes are, how do I want to use this space? What do I want to do in my backyard? What's my vision for this space? Do I want to be around the backyard fire with my friends? Write that down. Do I have areas that are super sunny and hot and we never spend time in, but if we put in a thoughtful arbor or trellis, it would make it a comfortable place to be in the backyard? Do you want a pond? Are there things going on out in the street? Maybe you live next to a particularly busy street. Note that down. Write down all of those things that are going to influence the decisions that go into your backyard. Do you have dogs? There's some allowances that you might want to make for your dogs. Maybe we need to keep the plant material off the fence because your dogs like to run back and forth along the fence. Don't fight it. Don't put plants there. It's not going to work. Just accommodate those uses, but be realistic about yourself, with yourself about how you want to use those spaces. And that's going to make your landscape a lot easier, and it's going to serve you better in the long run. Another question I want you to ask yourself is, can you phase the project? Are there pieces that maybe you can do in the short term and leave others to the long term so that you don't feel stressed about tilling up the entire backyard and now having to deal with that over the course of one summer? Maybe there's some pieces you can do. You can concentrate in one area, but that involves identifying your priority for what you want out of your backyard, right? The next piece is to kind of move on to the concept drawing. And you don't want to move on to this piece yet until you've really thought about the first two phases. You've got your site plan in place, and you've done your constraints analysis so you know where your opportunities, you know where your constraints are, and how that works together for you in your landscape. This next phase, which is your concept drawing, is a really loose drawing. It doesn't take, I'm talking a lot about drawing, but you don't have to have mad drawing skills to do this. You'll notice I got my highlighters out. I think I probably had my daughter's Crayola markers this day that I was working, because you're working with what's available to you. But it's broad strokes. So we've got, we've identified in orange. I've said, hey, these are the where we need to put our more drought-tolerant plant material, because those overlapped where we had the most sun in the yard, so that makes sense. Sod, I know I generally want it here. We got a trampoline, got to accommodate that trampoline in the backyard just a little bit, so that seems like a thoughtful place to put that turf and where the kids are going to be playing around. What do we need to screen? Remember, I talked about there were plants already in place that did a lot of the screening that needed to be done, and I've got those marked kind of with this rough line up through here. We've got fence on the perimeter, and then patio and fire pit. This seems like a good place, near the back door, up next to the patio, where your friends and family are going to congregate. And you can move this around and play with this as many times as you want, and I would encourage you to do so. How would it be if we put the fire pit further out in the yard? How would it be if we move the trampoline closer to the back door? Is that gonna cut off my traffic patterns through my yard? You know how you use your yard. You know where you come in the gate. You know how you go through your yard, and if you go out through the back side, if you got a shed or an office in the back, you know how you need to travel through that, and you need to mark those pieces in too to make sure that your improvements are fitting with your traffic patterns in your yard so that you're not putting something in a place that's impeding the flow. So like I said, real general. Big blobs, scribbles, whatever works for you. As long as it speaks to you and you understand what you're doing, then it works. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the key elements of design, some rules, if you will, for landscaping that I want to share with you, and some things that I use quite often when I'm designing for private clients. Hardscape First. Now, this is almost, I think, maybe one of the hardest rules because it's spring today. How many of you already checked out the plant material at Home Depot and Lowe's to see what's coming in, right? And it is so tempting to buy a few plants and get home and put them in the ground. But if you haven't done your hardscape first, chances are they're not going to make it. They're going to get trampled over. You're going to put them in the wrong spot. Or when you finally settle on what you're going to do with the hardscape, you're going to have to dig them up anyway, and you're going to kill them. But I am just as guilty as everyone else. I go to Home Depot, and I see what's blooming that week, and I get so excited, and you want to take things home. This is the piece that you have to resist. You've got to handle your decks, your patios, your fences, your pathways, ponds, fire pits, whatever it is, those pieces have to go in first, and they help organize your landscape when you get those done. They help create clean lines. It's like when you're starting with a coloring book. You've got nice open space. You get to decide what colors go in each space, but you've got to start with that clean outline first. You can mix materials. It doesn't necessarily have to be all sandstone throughout the yard. You can do different combinations of things, whether it be concrete, but be thoughtful about how you want to do it when you put it all together. Mixing textures is often delightful. It adds up a bunch of visual relief in your yard. So it doesn't necessarily all have to be the same, but think about it and do the hardscape first. The other reason it's easy to go to the plant store and get plants is it costs a lot less than the patio and the arbor. And you feel like you're making progress, right? Because you dug a hole in the backyard. But resist doing that and start with the bigger structural pieces first. This is the law of significant enclosure. And I want to talk to you a little bit about this because in our yards, we have places that we want to feel more intimate, and we have places that we want to feel more open. We probably don't want the trampoline with a hedge all the way around it 5 feet from the edge. It's not going to be very comfortable, and that's not the point of the trampoline, right? We're all out there jumping so we can peek over into the neighbor's fence, right? But there are places, like up on your patio, where you want things to be more intimate. So there's a ratio that needs to be respected to make it feel more intimate. And it's basically 1 to 3. So the vertical edge has to be 1/3 the length of the horizontal distance. So when you do that, your height has to be, let me think about this. Sometimes when you type it makes sense. But your vertical length on the ground must be 1/3 the height. So if you've got a foot on the ground, you want 3 feet up, right? And that's what that ratio is what's gonna start making it feel enclosed. The higher it goes, the more enclosed the space is gonna be, but you're gonna have to minimally meet that 1/3 ratio to make your space feel intimate. So write that number down and think about it when you're planning your backyard. The next piece is the regulating line that I want to talk about. So we've got a home here. You can see the roof line, and this has got a landscape laid down on it. The regulating line is a piece that imparts rhythm in your landscape. Your eye, automatically, you don't have to do anything, your brain and your eyes do this. They recognize flow lines and hard lines within your landscape. And your brain will want to follow and see a continuation of those hard lines. Our homes, as a hard structure in the landscape, do that for us. And we want to make sure that we respect that. This applies not only to modern or more stylized landscape, but it also applies to your more natural landscapes as well. And you'll see this. So here's a line on the front of the house, and it's lined up with this pool element. One portion of it is lined up and aligned with that line. Here's another regulating line on the edge of the house, and the landscaping is aligned with that as well. Here's another one, kind of emphasizes the front door, and now you start to see how all of these pieces start to come into balance. You've got to respect some of those hard lines. Fences will do it. It doesn't mean everything has to be straight lined in your yard, but you have to respect some of those dominating lines and work with them. You can't work against them, or your yard starts to be confusing to the mind. The golden ratio is another ratio that I want to share with you. It's a ratio of proportion, and it helps provide balance and order in the layout of not only structures, sod, landscape beds, grass spaces, all of those elements in your yard. And it's roughly 1 to 1.68. A great example of this is, and most of us, a lot of people can just do it naturally. You look at a rectangle and you know it's balanced appropriately, but there's an actual number that helps us align and make sure that we have the proportions right. An example is a 5x8 garden bed. So if you were to take the 4 or the short edge on the rectangle, which would be 5 feet, and you multiply that by the 1.618, that gives you the 8 feet. That would be a perfectly balanced garden bed or space or rectangle in your landscape. If you can use that for lawn patches, you can use it for patios. And the interesting thing about this is it's actually happened in architecture and landscape for hundreds of years. The Greeks actually used this number and used it in their architecture. And it's closely related to the Fibonacci sequence, which is a series of numbers that go together. Who knows about the Fibonacci sequence? Okay, so how this works is it's this series of numbers, and you add them up. The 0 plus the 1 equals 1. The 1 plus the 1 equals 2. The 2 plus the 3 equals 5. So you see the pattern starting to develop. Most of the numbers as they go out are odd numbers. And if you've been with landscaping much, most people tell you that you need to plant things in odd numbers, unless, of course, you want to balance or frame something. So it's very interesting that these are tied together, both the golden ratio and the Fibonacci sequence, and that they've been used for hundreds of years in architecture and landscapes throughout time. As this comes together, for the math nerds, this is how the ratio, how it looks out in the mathematical equation. I don't think like this. I like the proportion, that 1 to 1.6. I can do the math on that. That works for me. Coincidentally, for those of you that are familiar with the Fibonacci sequence and that sequence of numbers, do you know what the Greek symbol is for this equation? Any guesses? So it's feet. Yep. And I thought that was really interesting when I was researching this, because that one leads back to that balance of visual balance that we see in architecture throughout history. It really is that old and has that long of reference for us. So when you're thinking about your spaces, sometimes we can't decide what size to do things. Use these ratios to help you make those decisions, and you'll always get it right. Another thing, you may find yourself in a position where you got to do steps in your yard. Sometimes it's hard to decide how to put that together, but there is an actual equation and numerical boundary that you need to keep when you're designing steps in your yard. This helps you decide how many you need to go down or up. Always, 2 times the rise of your step plus the run, which is that length, should equal 26. So you can have a 4-inch step and do your run longer, but it's got to equal 26 in the end. And they must always be even. If they're not even, and you've got one at 5, one at 4, one up to 8, you're creating a hazardous condition in your yard and for your visitors. So always keep that in mind. Another common thing you'll be doing in your yard is sitting. Sometimes we like to do seats that aren't necessarily benches. Maybe it's a boulder. Maybe it's stumps that you want to utilize. That 18 to 24 inches is the sweet spot for a comfortable place for people to sit and enjoy the yard. So keep that piece of dimension in mind as well as you go through. A few more rules. Always plant large to small. So going back to I said hardscape first. We've got our hardscape done, right? Now we need to do our large trees and our large installations. Because if we start with the small things first, maybe when we drag in that big 3-inch tree that we have saved all summer for and we know exactly what we want, we don't want to trample what we've already put in. We want to make sure that we can get in with our tree, have good access, and get it into the space that it deserves to be. Plants can also be used to help respect those regulating lines, set the boundaries and the perimeters for your yard. So especially if it's your more structural things, your trees, your shrubs, those are help setting that framework for your landscape. And that's why they need to be the next piece. And you'll see I said, resist temptation to go with the small stuff first. And remember, evergreens play a critical role in your landscape. We all love the flowers, but you've got to have those things in your yard that give you staying power through the winter. Sometimes it's junipers. They're not all bad. Yeah. But your mugo pine, your blue spruce, those pieces play a really important role in sustaining your landscape through the winter and giving a space for wildlife. So you've got something to look at while we're trapped inside all winter, Planting in masses. It's pleasing to the eye to have clumps of color and plant material. It's relaxing. When you mix too many things up, your mind can't settle on something and it can't read it. So make sure that you're planting in masses. And this is where those quantities come in that I mentioned of the Fibonacci series. 1, 3, 5. Use an even number if you're framing something. So in other words, a front door, a view of a certain piece of your yard, a trellis or a structural element. That's when you would use an even number. Oddly enough, when you run the Fibonacci sequence out, there's only, I believe, 3 even numbers in between 0 and 38. You get 38, 8, and 2. So if you stick with that sequence, you're going to balance your plant material throughout your yard. And repeat. So drought-proof containers, I want to talk a little bit about this. This is a super great way to add some color into your landscape and some architectural elements. You can also use this, often we get really attached to our annuals. I know I do. I have the ones that my mother always planted, so those hold a special place for me. I want to see my petunias in the yard and what's another big one everybody already plant? Oh, geraniums. Yeah, your geraniums. But those require a lot of water, right, in your landscape and a lot of attention. So you can highlight those and isolate some of those things into pots throughout your yard. You can fit them with drip and you don't have to worry about it. And they will maintain themselves. And it's the color of the pots can often draw attention to some of those favorite pieces that you have in your yard, and put them in strategic locations so that they're highlighted in your landscape. Living carpet, this is another opportunity to really use mass planting throughout your yard. You'll see this is probably what somebody traditionally would have put a sod or turf in this location, but this is a low-growing Veronica, I believe, in this one, and it looks fantastic. It's a wonderful guide to the front door. It says, this is where you enter, come by these beautiful flowers, but yet it doesn't require as much water. And that mass, the mass and the swath that they chose to put that in, makes a wonderful entrance and helps bring you into the yard. Ornamental features. There's some great elements that you can use to add interest to your yard. It doesn't always have to be about plants, but sometimes it is. Maybe a super special plant that you want to highlight. Maybe it's sculpture. Maybe it's rock. All of those elements help add to the interest of your yard. And it's all of these pieces together. The large trees, the shrubs, the hardscape, all of those things done in a very thoughtful and purposeful manner that help make your landscape beautiful. How many of you have heard this? We bought a $2 plant in a $5 hole. I mentioned earlier as one of the Xeriscape principles is that every time you do something in your yard, that's an opportunity for you to improve your soil conditions. Whatever you spend on that plant, if you improve the soil conditions, you dig it extra wide, not extra deep, extra wide, you add compost and extra material to support that plant down the line, your landscape material is going to thrive even longer. All of these pieces help hold moisture in and around those plants, and that's what helps contribute to some of those Xeriscape practices, because you're improving that soil profile, and all that improvement is about helping it hold water and helping it hold nutrients where the plants need it. So each and every time that you spend money on a plant, plan to spend money on your compost or soil improvements as you move along. The City of Greeley, we typically recommend 4 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet when you're doing a turf. If you're doing native, it's 2 cubic yards per 1,000 square feet, or a 1.5-inch deep layer across the top surface of your landscaped area. And I want to note, always make sure that you don't do an animal byproduct. And what I mean by that is something that smells of manure. An experience today, I went to check on a project in one of our parks, and I drove up and I could smell the compost before I got out of the vehicle. That is a bad sign. It should never smell like it's parent material. Never, ever. It's not composted if it still smells like it's parent material. So beware of that. Always check your products and where you're getting them from. If you choose something that comes from a non-animal based source, you're even better off. If you can get a compost that comes from plant-based materials, you'll never run into a problem with that affecting your plants or killing your plants because it's too strong. Moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about local code requirements, and I know this is often the least fun part of the presentation, but it's not a whole lot of fun if you've spent 4 weekends in your yard and code enforcement shows up on the 5th weekend and says you can't do that. So we want to make sure that we include that at this discussion as well. Right-of-ways and parkways. So this is often the public area that's up on the street in front of your home. The right-of-way from the street can extend into your yard. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's up to the sidewalk if you have a detached sidewalk. This is a detached sidewalk scenario here. So I think most people would reasonably say, well, the parkway extends to the sidewalk. That is not always true. It depends on the size street that you live on. Your parkway may run clear up into some portions of your front yard and the right-of-way, but you need to know where it's at. So make sure that you're fully aware of where your right-of-way is. And it impacts the types of plantings you can do within the right-of-way. So in other words, if you're going to do work up here on the parkway, in general, you will need a permit, and you have to apply to do planting and new landscaping within this right-of-way up next to the street. It's got to be at least 50% plant material, so you can't just put it in rock and think you can forget it. That's not how it works, because as we talked about, we've got to have that plant material up on the street for calming and our neighbors and the cohesiveness of our neighborhoods. You'll add trees. You can add trees up in the parkway if it's allowed, but you've got to have your plant material no taller than 18 inches because of these driveway clear zones. You've got to be able to back out of the driveway and see oncoming traffic, or for that matter, bicyclists and kids on their scooters or whatever it may be. So you've got to keep that plant material low up in the right-of-way. Your landscape standards, all the yards, excluding the hardscaped areas, have to be landscaped in some form or another. So bare dirt, except for in vegetable gardens in off-season, is not allowed. You've got to meet that at least 50% of natural yard area, and it has to be live plantings. So 50% of it can be mulched bed. It doesn't have to all be green, but you've got to have 50% live plant material. And that's a measurement based on the actual plantable space in your front yard. So it doesn't count your driveway. It counts the actual plantable space. Any areas that are visible from a public right-of-way or street have to be planted and maintained. So if it's the side yard is visible to the street, you're responsible for that. If it's the front yard, maybe you're unlucky, you got 3 sides on public access, all of those will have to be landscaped. If it's not visible from the public right-of-way or an adjacent property, you got to keep it free from weeds, and it can't be bare dirt. So that applies to your backyard as well, behind the fence. When do these landscape requirements apply? So that's during new construction. If you're putting in something new, making new updates to your yard, you've got to apply to the landscape requirements then. If you do a significant change, if you're converting your yard from a traditional landscape to a xeric landscape, you need to follow the regulations. If you alter any more than 50% of your yard, like I said, that doesn't include the driveway. If you alter more than 50% of a planting area, you need to follow code. If you remove any tree on the front street or side yard, you've got to follow landscape code. And then if you're converting anything to Xeriscape, I think we mentioned that already. And then yards that haven't been maintained are primarily dirt, and your new owner, maybe you're going to finally address that issue, you have to follow the landscape code. So maintenance. I've talked for 50 minutes now, and we haven't talked much about maintenance, have we? I've talked about having a serious conversation with yourself about how much maintenance you want to do and letting that inform the decisions that you make in your yard, but I haven't really talked about maintenance. And the reason for that is if you follow these principles, the 7, my 8, Xeriscape design principles, if you go through the site planning process and take the time to do it, if you follow some of those key elements of design and those ratios that I gave you, follow the local code requirements, your maintenance is going to automatically come into line for you because you've been thoughtful about putting the plants in the right places. You've been thoughtful about making sure you have your pathways where they need to be and where you want to access the yard. You've thought about your wet spots, and you haven't planted plants that prefer dry conditions in the lowest spot of your yard that collects the most rainwater, because you know that's the lowest spot, and maybe that's a better spot for a self-fed rain garden to support your plant material that's free water. You've gone through this decision-making process. You've gone through the iterations. And as a result, the maintenance is going to fall in line with you, for you. Many people end up doing way more maintenance than they intended because they overwatered their landscape. And you may have selected xeric plant material, but if you put extra water on it, you're either going to kill it or it's going to grow crazy. Rabbit brush out on the prairie gets about this high. But I can show you yards where rabbit brush has grown this high because it's watered too much. So you can affect how the culture of any plant if you do not treat it appropriately. And that will automatically affect the amount of time you have to spend in your yard pruning, cutting back. If you put something on the side of your driveway that was too big and shouldn't be there, and now you've got to trim it every fall because it's outside of its regular growing regime, those are the things that are going to really affect the maintenance and really cause people to lose love of their yards and their landscaping because they're spending more time on it than they want to. So follow these rules, and I guarantee that your maintenance will fall into line for you. So with that, I think I've added some helpful links and websites that relate to city code and some things like that. I'm going to check these again. I think Ruth was going to put the sheet back up on the website. The slides, you post those, right? So we'll check and make sure that these are all accurate when it gets posted to the website, and those are your resources to follow up if you need to. There's also some books and resources that I took and referenced throughout my slide presentation, so that is on there as well. I'd like to open it up for a few questions. If you've got some burning desires, if you're going to ask me deep questions about the Fibonacci sequence, I'm not your math guru, but I know how to apply it. So the question is, shallow-rooted trees, can we still xeriscape some of those areas? We're working a lot with our parks and doing some turf conversions throughout our parks. And one of the complicated things about that is if you have mature trees that are reliant on existing irrigation systems, right? You can't turn the water off to those trees, especially in shallow-rooted trees, because they're getting their moisture from that previous landscape treatment. So we've been having a lot of conversation about that. What do you do? My advice to you, yes, you can convert it to a xeriscape, but you're going to have to provide some supplemental water somehow for the tree, whether it be a deep-rooted once a month, depending on the size of the tree when you're really watering it down, or maybe you're just putting in drip under mulch exclusively for the tree and not planting. You're right, you're going to have some consideration for that condition. And there's lots of opportunities, but the piece is to think about it, right? And recognize that the changes you are making are going to have an effect. The question is how that calculation of 50% of your yard, and Ruth, chime in if I get it wrong, but the drip line of your tree, if you have a mature tree and you measure across the diameter, that counts as 50% of live plant material toward that total space. So it's the entire drip line of the tree plus whatever plant material you may have. Okay. They don't have to be straight. The question was about the regulating line, and I showed it in a very rigid format because it's very easy to see visually. It doesn't have to be straight line. You can use curvilinear beds, but you better make sure that it follows that general outline that your house or your structures have already put together. So it can be, if you've got a hard line here, it can be curvilinear. but let it continue that line, or start it over here and it's still following in the same direction.
Curve after the line.
Absolutely. It can have rounded edges. It absolutely works. But you've got to pay attention to those hard lines because of the way your brain and the eye reads it. It gets confusing. If all of a sudden you head something out to askew, all of a sudden your landscape and your layout doesn't read well. The question is about HOAs and HOA regulations versus city regulations. Often HOAs will have more stringent regulations than city regulations. It depends on your individual HOA, and you have to know what the rules of your HOA are on top of the city regulations. Like I said, often they are going to be more stringent and more regulated. For example, I did a design for my sister down south of Brighton, and she had to have whatever landscape design she did approved. All the pieces were there. It was approved. We did a native grass in the front yard, but we chose something that got 6 to 8 inch high. Well, the HOA regulation said anything over 3 inches, any grasses over 3 inches were considered rogue vegetation. And she got cited to cut, even though they approved it, she got cited to cut the grass in her front yard monthly. And it was an unfortunate experience. So you're right, you're gonna have to contact your HOA to figure out what their specific rules are because it's different across the city. If you're gonna bring in soil that you're going to be planting in, you always wanna bring in topsoil. And I recommend amended topsoil. If you go to any of the big suppliers and you ask for an amended topsoil, they're gonna supply you something it should have the texture of a sandy loam, but it's gonna have some more organic content in it than just dirt, if you will. They're mixing and they're adding something to it. Because you're right, you couldn't afford to just bring in compost in those quantities. So you're gonna want an amended topsoil. I would also recommend that you still do your compost treatments to any areas that you're going to plant into because you're gonna need that additional material, but you need it at the top layer, right? You don't need it if you're doing 3-foot berms, you don't need it at the bottom of the 3-foot berm. You need it in that root profile up at the top of the soil. I always recommend a compost that does not have animal-based material in it. When we're talking about the $5 hole and the $2 plant. Always use a compost or try to get a compost that is not animal-based. And when I say animal-based, that's manure. And you're gonna know if it has manure in it and it's not composted well because it's gonna smell really strong. A good judge of your soil, if you can pick it up and take a good whiff at it, don't let anybody see you sniffing the dirt. My friends laugh at me about this all the time. If it smells earthy, almost like after it rains, you know you've got a good product. It's when it starts to have kind of that pungent urine smell to it that you can get into trouble. The ratios, if you can do at least, like if you're just digging the hole and not doing a whole landscaped bed, if you can get to that 50-50, 75-25, take all the dirt out of the hole, mix it, go back in, you're gonna be in a really good place. I wanna thank you all for coming and spend some time with me this evening. I'm super excited that the weather is warming and we actually get into our yards now. We've got all this pent up energy, so I hope I've supplied you with some valuable information as you start looking to plan and install your new landscape. Happy gardening.
These are the remaining lecture series. March 20th is, of course, the one you're at. It's Xeriscape design with maintenance in mind. But we have fruit trees coming up next, how to build a rain garden, and make sure you check back to the website for those when you want to sign up. I want to remind you that we are doing the rain barrel compost bin sale again this year. We have a limited number of discounts, so don't wait till the last minute to sign up for that. You'll go to the webpage, greeleygov.com/conserve, and you're going to get to a picture that looks like this, and just click on this link, and then that'll send you to the website where we're selling them. We have an independent contractor selling them. And then you'll pick them up in May. Garden in the Box is now on sale if you're interested in an easy, pre-planned garden in a box, Xeriscape garden. Go ahead and order those online, and that pickup day is May 18th. I mentioned this at the first one, that we'll be looking for some volunteers and possibly some people to work in the Xeriscape garden this summer. If you have an interest in that, on your survey, you could just write it on there and let us know and give us your information. We'll be in touch.